Imagine waking up one morning and finding out that the most powerful military force in human history, a force that has been sitting in your backyard for over 80 years, is quietly packing its bags. Not because it lost a war, not because someone forced it out at gunpoint, but because the countries that used to beg for its protection stopped needing it. And in its place, something new arrived. Not tanks, not warships, not soldiers in boots. Something far more quiet, far more deeply embedded, and in many ways, far more dangerous. What replaced those American boots on the ground was a network of invisible wires, glowing screens, data centers humming in desert cities, and the logo of a Chinese company on every single tower. This is not a prediction. This is happening right now. And if you think this doesn't affect you, wherever you are in the world, you have no idea how wrong you are. The United States, CENTCOM, the U.S. Central Command, is the military machine that runs American military operations across 21 countries, from Egypt to Kazakhstan, from Syria to Pakistan. CENTCOM is not just a military base. It is the spine of American power in the most volatile, most oil-rich, most strategically critical region on Earth. It controls who gets weapons. It controls who gets protected. It controls who gets to sleep at night knowing there's an aircraft carrier just over the horizon. For decades, that power was absolute. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, they built their entire security around one simple idea. America will be there. America will always be there. And for a long time, that was true. But then something changed. Actually, several things changed at the same time. And when you stack them all together, what you get is a picture so dramatic, so fast-moving, that most people haven't even realized what has already happened. The first crack appeared not with a war, but with a phone call that never came. It was September 14th, 2019. Early in the morning, massive drone strikes hit the heart of Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure. A structure, Abqaiq, Kurais, two facilities responsible for processing more than 5% of the entire world's oil supply, gone in one night. Fires that could be seen from space, the biggest disruption to global oil supply in history. And Saudi Arabia picked up the phone and called Washington. And Washington hesitated. There was no immediate military strike on Iran. There was no decisive response. There were words. There were statements. There were more words. But the moment that Gulf leaders had feared, the moment when they would need America most, came and went, and America moved slowly. That hesitation planted a seed of doubt so deep in the minds of Gulf leaders that it has been growing ever since. Beck Oz in the Middle East, hesitation is not a policy. Hesitation is a signal, and the signal was clear. America's protection is no longer guaranteed. Now, you might say, that was one incident. That was one president's decision. But here is what makes this story so much bigger than one incident. Look at what happened in the years that followed. The U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021. The chaotic, humiliating, televised collapse of everything America had built there over 20 years. Gone in 2 weeks. Gulf leaders watched that. They watched it very carefully, because they understood something that most Western commentators missed entirely. If America could walk away from Afghanistan, a country it had invested trillions of dollars and thousands of lives into, then America could walk away from anywhere, including them, including the Gulf, including the bases and treaties and security guarantees they had built their entire national strategy around. Then, in 2022, something else happened. Russia invaded Ukraine, and suddenly the entire world got a lesson in how quickly a superpower's attention can shift. CENTCOM's resources, Washington's strategic focus, American weapons, American political capital, it all tilted toward Europe, toward NATO, toward a war that had nothing to do with the Middle East. And the Gulf states sat there watching the U.S. send hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine, while their own requests for advanced weapon systems, for faster military approvals, for stronger security treaties, sat in bureaucratic queues in Washington. And then Donald Trump came back. And with him came the most explicit statement any American president has ever made about the Middle East. You need to pay for your own security. The transactional era had begun. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, these countries were now being told that the American military umbrella was not free, that it came with conditions, that it came with expectations, and in some cases, that it might not come at all. Here's where the story takes a turn that most people are not ready for. While Washington was distracted, while American policy was drifting, while Gulf leaders were quietly door, and that someone had very deep pockets, very advanced technology, and absolutely zero interest in asking Gulf countries to respect human rights, hold elections, or change how they run their governments, that someone was China. And when China knocked on the door, the Gulf states did not hesitate. They opened it wide. Let's start with what China actually brought to the table. because this is where things get fascinating and a little terrifying, depending on which side of the table you're sitting on. Huawei. The name alone is enough to make American intelligence officials lose sleep. By 2025, Huawei's 5G infrastructure was embedded in the telecommunications networks of every single Gulf Cooperation Council state. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, every one of them. This is not a small thing. 5G is not just fast internet for your phone. 5G is the nervous system of a modern state. It runs hospitals. It runs power grids. It runs financial systems. It runs military communications. When Huawei builds your 5G network, it knows everything that moves through it. It knows the patterns. It knows the vulnerabilities. And the US government has been screaming this warning for years, but the Gulf states kept building because Huawei was cheaper, Huawei was faster, and Huawei did not ask for anything in return except the contract. But it goes far deeper than 5G. Look at cloud computing. Alibaba Cloud entered the Saudi market through a joint venture with Saudi telecom company, STC, the biggest telecom in the kingdom. Tencent launched its own regional cloud services in Saudi Arabia in early 2025. Huawei Cloud has data centers across the Gulf. TEHISE are not small pilot programs. These are full-scale commercially critical infrastructure partnerships that handle government data, military logistics, financial transactions, and all intelligence systems. And America's best, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, they are present too. But they are competing on a playing field that has already been tilted by years of Chinese investment, lower prices, and a complete absence of political conditions. And then there is artificial intelligence. The technology that every government in the world right now understands will decide the future of military power, economic power, and national security. The Gulf states are not observers in the AI race. They are active players. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 has artificial intelligence E at its very core. The UAE created the world's first government minister dedicated entirely to AI. And who are they partnering with to build their AI future? The answer is both. Penn AI and NVIDIA are all present in the UAE. AWS and NVIDIA are embedded in Saudi Arabia. But so is Huawei. And Huawei's Ascend 910C AI chip, as of 2025, is only one generation behind the best American offerings. One generation. In a race that is moving at the speed of light, one generation is almost nothing. And Chinese technology firms are closing that gap every single month. Here's the detail that should make every American strategist sit straight up in their chair. In Saudi hospitals, Chinese AI platforms that were deployed through Huawei's healthcare systems cut diagnostic processing times by 40%. Not in a test. In real hospitals. With real patients. With Arabic language models that American platforms could not match. Because American companies had not invested in Arabic AI the way Chinese companies had. They targeted the language, they targeted the culture, they targeted the specific needs of the region, and they won those contracts, not through bribery or coercion. They won them by being better at doing the specific job that needed to be done. Now let's talk about what China is doing militarily, because this is where the conversation gets even more serious. China is not trying to replace CENTCOM, not yet, not directly. China does not have 50,000 troops in the Middle East. It does not have aircraft carriers patrolling the Persian Gulf. Its single overseas military base is in Djibouti, a small country at the entrance to the Red Sea. But what China is doing is far more strategic than simply parking ships and soldiers in the region. China is building relationships, deep, carefully cultivated long-term security relationships that position it to matter, militarily, when the time is right. In October 2025, China conducted its third consecutive joint naval exercise with the Royal Saudi Naval Forces. The operation was called Blue Sword 2025. Saudi and Chinese warships operating together in the same waters, practicing the same drills, building the same military vocabulary. A U.S. analyst who studied the exercise put it simply, China is not missing a single opportunity to develop security relationships with countries in the region, not one single opportunity. And then there is the Houthi Red Sea crisis, one of the most revealing moments of recent years for understanding exactly what kind of power China now has in the Middle East. When Houthi Force S began attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea in late 2023, the United States and United Kingdom launched military operations. Operation Pro's Parity Guardian, spending enormous resources on airstrikes, naval deployments, and a sustained military campaign that lasted well into 2025. China's response was different. Beijing reached what analysts described as an unspoken arrangement with the Houthis, an implicit deal that Sea Heinz-flagged ships would be left alone. And they were. Chinese vessels moved through the Red Sea while American and British operations lit up the sky with expensive missiles. The message was not subtle. China had influence that American military power could not buy. And consider this number. China receives more than half of Allied its foreign oil imports from the Middle East, more than 50%. For China, the security of the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Strait of Hormuz is not an abstract foreign policy concern. It is an existential economic leifel-ein. And China is not the kind of power that leaves its existential interests in the hands of someone else, especially not in the hands of America. Before we go further, let us stop for a moment and talk about the thing no one in Washington likes to say out loud, the thing that the diplomats and the generals hint at in private meetings but rarely say on the record, the thing that explains, more than anything else, why this shift is happening so fast and why it is so difficult to reverse. America's word does not carry the same weight it used to. That is the brutal truth that sits at the center of everything in this story. It is not about capability. America's military is still the most powerful on the planet. It is not about resources. America still has the largest defense budget in the world by a factor that dwarfs every other nation. It is about credibility. It is about whether the people whose security depends on American promises actually believe those promises will be kept when the moment arrives. And after Afghanistan. After the hesitation of 2019, after 4 years of a Trump presidency that treated defense alliances as protection rackets, after a Biden presidency that pivoted to Ukraine and left Middle Eastern partners wondering where they stood, after a second Trump term that is now explicitly talking about withdrawing FRO, the credibility deficit is real. It is measurable. It shows up in the polling. It shows up in the OR. Ms. deals. It shows up in the diplomatic language. The Gulf leaders are still polite to American visitors. They still attend the summits. They still sign the statements. But behind closed doors, the calculation has changed. They are hedging. And the hedge they are buying, the insurance policy against American unreliability, is being written in Chinese. There is one more layer to this that makes the whole picture even more complicated, and it has to do with money. Specifically, with the extraordinary amount of money that China has deployed in the Middle East through its Belt and Road Initiative. Since 2013, China has committed hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure investment across the region. Ports, roads, railways, power plants, industrial zones, the kind of physical infrastructure that creates deep, lasting economic dependencies that are almost impossible to untangle once they are in place. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Iraq, and Iran are all significant belt and road partners. When China builds your port, China knows exactly what moves through it. When China builds your railway, China helped design where it goes. When China finances your power plant, China has leverage over your energy supply. This is not conspiracy theory. This is standard great power strategy. The same strategy that America used in Western Europe after World War II with the Marshall Plan. China has adapted that playbook for the 21st century, and it is executing it with enormous discipline and enormous patience. In fact, right now, in February 2026, the United States just launched its largest military buildup in the Middle East since 2023. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group has arrived in the region. Additional air power, naval forces, and missile defense systems are all being deployed. The immediate reason is Iran, specifically rising tensions around Iran's nuclear program and its missile capabilities. So American military power is not disappearing from the Middle East, not today, not this week, not this year, but here is the strategic problem that no amount of aircraft carriers can solve. You can park a carrier strike group off the coast of Bahrain, but if Bahrain's 5G network runs on Huawei hardware, then the intelligence that flows through that network, including intelligence about American military positions, American operational planning, and American vulnerabilities, could potentially be accessible to people in Beijing. You can sign a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. But if Saudi Arabia's cloud computing infrastructure is built on Alibaba's servers, then THE data of the Saudi state lives partially in Chinese-built systems. You can have the most powerful military on Earth. But if the countries you are supposed to be protecting have already decided to build their digital future with your main rival, then what exactly are you protecting them from? This is the central paradox that American strategists are wrestling with right now, and they do not have a clean answer. Part of the problem is internal to Washington. In 2025 and 2026, the United States released its new national defense strategy. And for the first time in recent memory, the Middle East is not the top priority. China is the top priority, but the primary theater for confronting China is the Pacific, not the Gulf. The secondary concern in the new strategy is the Western Hemisphere, what officials have called a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, focused on Mexico, the Caribbean, and South America. Europe, ohms third because of Russia. The Middle East, the place where CENTCOM has OPI. You're rated for decades. Is essentially fourth on the list. And when you are fourth on a list, resources follow accordingly. This means fewer American troops in the region over time, fewer advanced weapon systems approved for sale, fewer high-level diplomatic visits, less political attention, less strategic commitment. And Gulf leaders can read a budget document just as well as any Pentagon analyst. They know what fourth place means. Now here is what makes this situation so unique in modern history, and what makes it genuinely alarming if you think about the long-term consequences. The Gulf states are not choosing China over America. They are choosing both. They are building what diplomats call a strategic hedge. They want the American military umbrella to stay up. They want the U.S. carrier in the Gulf. They want the THAAD missile defense systems that protect their cities from Iranian ballistic missiles. But at the same time, they want Chinese 5G. They want Chinese cloud. They want Chinese AI. They want Chinese investment through the Belt and Road Initiative. They want trade with China, which, as of 2025, has replaced the United States as the goal, F's largest trading partner. They want all of it simultaneously. And for now, remarkably, they are getting all of it. But this situation cannot last forever, because at some point the two worlds will collide. Consider what happens if America asks Saudi Arabia to choose sides in a confrontation with China over Taiwan. Consider what happens if Washington tells Riyadh, you can have our military protection, but you have to rip out the Huawei towers. Consider what happens if Beijing tells Gulf states, we need your oil, but we also need you to reduce your military cooperation with CENTCOM. These moments are coming. The only question is when. And when they arrive, the choices that Gulf leaders make in those moments will reshape the entire balance of global power. And we cannot tell this story without talking about Iran, because Iran is the reason CENTCOM exists in its current form. Iran is the adversary that, all more than any other single factor, has kept American troops in the region and kept Gulf leaders picking up the phone to Washington. But even on Iran, even on the one issue where America and the Gulf states are most aligned, things are changing in ways that should alarm American strategists. China has a deep, long-standing economic relationship with Iran. China is the largest buyer of Iranian oil, oil that American sanctions are supposed to prevent from reaching the market, but which flows to Chinese refineries through a network of shell companies and gray market arrangements that operate completely outside American legal reach. China buys Iranian oil. Iran uses that money to fund its military, its nuclear program, its proxies across the region. And then China turns around and sells advanced technology to Saudi Arabia, the country most threatened by Iran. China is simultaneously feeding the fire and selling fire extinguishers. And it is making money on both sides of the deal. This is the kind of strategic positioning that a confident rising power can afford to make. Beijing does not see a contradiction in this. From China's perspective, having influence on both sides of the Gulf's greatest divide is not a problem. It is an asset. It is leverage. It gives China the ability to broker deals, the way China brokered the 2023 Saudi-Iran normalization, because both sides need China's goodwill. And every time China exercises that leverage successfully, it demonstrates to every government in the region that there is a new power broker in town. One that either always not come with lectures about democracy. One that does not threaten sanctions. One that does not have a domestic political constituency demanding military interventions. China comes with cash. China comes with technology. China comes with a phone number that gets answered and a seat at the table that was not there 10 years ago. Here is the in that every American president, every Secretary of State, every CENTCOM commander has to absorb. The Middle East is not the same place it was in 2001. It is not the same place it was in 2011. It is not even the same place it was in 2021. The region has changed faster in the last 5 years than it changed in the previous 20. New alliances, new technologies, new economic partnerships, new military doctrines, new leaders in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi who grew up watching America's wars and made very different conclusions from those wars than the generation before them. Young leaders who see the future differently, who believe in strategic autonomy, who believe in diversification, who are not willing to bet their entire national security on a single patron, no matter how powerful that patron claims to be. And so difficult for America to counter is that Beijing has spent the last decade building leverage without demanding loyalty. China never asked the Gulf states to choose. China just showed up with money, with technology, with trade deals and infrastructure investments and no political strings attached. While America was debating Saudi Arabia's human rights record, China was building data center ARs in Riyadh. While America was conditioning weapon sales on democratic reforms, China was offering surveillance technology with a handshake and a smile. And here's the number that captures this better than any geopolitical analysis ever could. According to Arab Barometer surveys from 2025, independent polling conducted across 12 Arab nations, China now ranks as the most popular external partner in the Arab world. More popular than the United States, more popular than Europe. partly because of China's perceived support for Palestinian rights during the Gaza conflict, partly because of years of investment and trade, partly because the image of America in the Arab world has been damaged by 2 decades of wars, occupations, drone strikes, and Abu Ghraib. The soft power equation, which American foreign policy once dominated, has tilted, and tilted hard. Now let's zoom in on the specific countries that matter most, because the details here are extraordinary. Qatar is perhaps the most paradoxical case in the entire Middle East. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar is the largest American military base in the region, 10th, housed U.S. troops. The forward headquarters of CENTCOM itself, the nerve center of American air operations across the entire Middle East and Central Asia. It is, quite simply, irreplaceable. Without Al Udeid, American air power in the region collapses. And yet, Qatar simultaneously hosts Hamas political leadership in Doha. Qatar simultaneously has a deep trade and diplomatic relationship with Iran, America's primary adversary in the region. Qatar simultaneously uses Chinese-built infrastructure across significant portions of its national networks, in the most literal sense, playing all sides at once. And Qatar is not unique. Qatar is simply the most visible example of a phenomenon that is playing out across the entire Gulf. The UAE is another case study in strategic ambiguity. The UAE signed the Abraham Accords in 2020, normalizing relations with Israel, one of the biggest strategic victories for American Middle East policy in decades. And yet, at the very same time, the UAE was negotiating with Huawei for 5G infrastructure so extensively that the United States threatened to withhold advanced F-35 fighter jets from the deal. The UAE eventually agreed to limit Huawei's role in certain sensitive networks, but Huawei did not disappear from the UAE. It simply moved to different parts of the network. The back and forth between Washington and Abu Dhabi over Chinese technology has been ongoing for years, and it has not been fully resolved. Saudi Arabia's situation is the most consequential of all, because Saudi Arabia is the biggest, the most powerful, the most oil-rich, the most symbolically important country in the Arab world, and Saudi Arabia in 2025 and 2026 is doing something that would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. It is building a genuine relationship with China as a strategic alternative to its historical dependence on the United States. The Saudi-China relationship now includes joint military exercises, massive technology investment, Chinese markets and currencies other than US dollars, a practice known as petroyuan, and deep diplomatic engagement that includes China brokering the historic 2023 Saudi-Iran normalization deal. That deal alone, 2 countries that had been enemies for decades suddenly agreeing to restore diplomatic relations, with China as the mediator and not the United States, was one of the most significant diplomatic signals of the 21st century. It said, clearly and loudly to every government in the world, China can do things in the Middle East that America cannot. Now bring all of this together and ask yourself the question that matters most. Is CENTCOM ending? Not today, not in the next year. The air CRAF carriers are still there. The bases are still operational. The troops are still deployed. Indeed, in some ways, the immediate military presence is actually growing in response to Iran, but the foundation that makes a CENTCOM meaningful, the political will of the host countries, the strategic trust bet, we in Washington and its Gulf partners, the exclusive dependence that once made American military power unchallengeable, that foundation is cracking. And it is being replaced by something new, not a Chinese military empire, not a dramatic confrontation between superpowers, something more subtle, something more modern. A world in which American troops guard the perimeter while Chinese companies run the networks inside. Think about what that means in practice. The U.S. military is one of the most sophisticated intelligence gathering organizations in human history. But military intelligence is only as good as the communications environment it operates in. If the communications environment in the countries where you operate has been built by your main strategic competitor, if the 5G towers, the cloud servers, the fiber optic, sea cables, the data centers were all installed by Huawei and Alibaba, then operating in that environment becomes fundamentally different. Every American general in the region understands this. Every intelligence officer understands this. They have been raising alarms about it for years. But the political and economic relationships that allowed Chinese tech to embed itself so deeply, those relationships were built over decades, and you cannot undo them with a policy memo. Here is the final piece of this picture, and it is the piece that makes this story not just about the Middle East, but about the entire future of global order. America is not losing the Middle East because it was defeated militarily. America is not losing the Middle East because China has a bigger army or a stronger economy. America is facing a challenge in the Middle East that is entirely new, and for which the old tools of power are largely useless. You cannot bomb a 5G network into irrelevance. You cannot sanction your way out of a cloud computing dependency. You cannot deploy a carrier strike group to a data center. The competition that is happening right now between American power and Chinese influence in the Middle East is a competition being fought in server rooms and fiber optic cables and AI laboratories. And the rules of that competition are completely different from anything that CENTCOM was built to handle. America has the best military in the world. It has the most advanced weapons, the most experienced soldiers, the deepest intelligence networks. But the Middle East in 2026 is not asking primarily for the world's best military. It is asking for the world's best 5G network. It is as king for artificial intelligence that works in Arabic. It is asking for cloud infrastructure that handles its government data without political interference. It is asking for a partner that will build its cities and connect its people and grow its economy without demanding anything in return except trade. And on all of those questions, America is losing ground. Not because it cannot compete, but because it chose not to for too long. While Washington was consumed by domestic politics and the pivot to the Pacific, Beijing was patient. Beijing was strategic. Beijing was building. And here is the darkest thought of all, the one that keeps the sharpest analysts awake at night. If China succeeds in making itself the indispensable technological partner of the Middle East, while America remains the indispensable military partner, then Beijing has achieved something extraordinary. It has created a situation where American soldiers protect Chinese infrastructure, where American taxpayer dollars fund the security of a region that has already bet its digital future on America's greatest rival, where CENTCOM exists, fully operational, fully armed, fully capable, but increasingly operating in a world that has already been shaped and is being shaped every day further by the country it was built to contain. Is that the end of CENTCOM? No, not yet. Maybe not for a very long time, but it is something just as important. It is the beginning of a world where American military power and Chinese technological power coexist in the same space, serving the same countries, competing for the same influence, and where the countries in the middle are growing more confident every day that they can have both, play both sides, and come out on top. Whether they are right about that, whether the United States will eventually force a choice, whether China will eventually make demands of its own, whether the whole delicate balance will one day collapse into something far more dangerous, that is the question that will define the next decade of global history. And right now, nobody, not in Washington, not in Beijing, not in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi or Doha, nobody knows the answer. What we do know is this: the Middle East is no longer a place that waits for America to decide its future. It is a place that is actively building a new one, quietly, deliberately, tower by tower, server by server, line of code by line of code, and the world that emerges from that construction, whether it is safer or more dangerous, more stable or more volatile, better for ordinary people or more tightly controlled by powers they never elected, that world is being built right now. And most people are not even watching. You just started watching. And that is exactly where this story begins. The clock is already ticking. The towers are already built. The servers are already running. The data is already die flowing. And the only question left is whether anyone in Washington has the vision and the will to respond before the window closes completely. History does not wait. Power does not pause. And the Middle East, ancient, patient, strategic to its core, has never been willing to wait for anyone. Not for Rome, not for Britain, and not for America. The future is being decided right now, not on a battlefield, in a data center, in a server room, in the quiet hum of a 5G tower standing in the desert, broadcasting to a world that is already changing faster than most people realize.